The night Silas Callaway asked God for a wife, the snow had already swallowed the lower fence line, and the wind had begun its long, scraping song against the cabin walls. He stood alone outside the house he had built with his own hands, on a stretch of Pennsylvania frontier that looked, in winter, like the end of the world. The barn roof had taken on a white burden. The woodpile stood lower than it should have. The lantern in the kitchen window burned like a tired eye. Inside there was bread enough, meat enough, timber enough, and silence enough to break a stronger man than he liked to imagine himself. He was 38 years old. He had land. He had a team, a herd, a rifle that rarely missed, and the sort of endurance neighbors admired because it saved them from having to ask whether endurance and loneliness were, in the end, different names for the same thing. What he did not have was a voice answering his own. What he did not have was warmth that did not come from fire. What he did not have was anyone to notice when he had worked too hard, or slept too little, or sat too long with his hands hanging useless over his knees after supper, because there was no purpose in speech when no one was there to hear it. That night, after another day of feeding cattle through drifts, repairing a split gatepost, and eating at his narrow table in the company of the clock, Silas stepped into the bitter dark, lifted his face toward the iron sky, and said the words aloud before pride could stop him. "If there is mercy left for a man like me," he said, "send me someone. Not for softness, not for vanity, just someone." His breath smoked out into the winter and vanished. If stories of lonely men, resilient women, and lives rebuilt from prayer, labor, and second chances speak to you, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. Silas listened to the wind for an answer and received none. Then he went back inside, barred the door, and slept badly, which had become his ordinary way of sleeping. 300 miles east, in a brick house on a narrow Boston street, where the lamps outside made even misery look respectable, Clara Winslow was being instructed to marry a man she had already decided would ruin her. Her aunt called it prudence. Her uncle called it rescue. The man himself, Mr. Horace Bellamy, called it providence, in a voice so oily that Clara had to force her hands to remain quiet in her lap whenever he visited. She was 26. Her father had been a shipping clerk with good handwriting and bad lungs. Her mother had sewn piecework by candlelight until her eyes failed and fever took the rest. When they died within a year of one another, Clara was folded into her aunt's household, not as a daughter, but as an obligation with hands. She kept accounts. She mended linen. She accompanied her cousins to shops she could not afford. She accepted the kind of gratitude that tasted of command. Over time, she learned two truths common to many women and spoken aloud by almost none. The first was that dependence became more expensive every year. The second was that respectable cruelty preferred clean gloves. Aunt Lydia did not shout when she wanted Clara bent. She only reminded her of expenses. Uncle Martin never struck the table. He simply explained the market value of gratitude. And when Bellamy began calling more often, with his narrow smile and his habit of speaking about Clara as if he were evaluating a parcel he expected to acquire, the entire household behaved as if the matter were already decided. "He has means," Aunt Lydia said one damp March evening, while Clara folded cuffs in the sitting room. "A woman in your situation cannot expect tenderness and stability at once." Clara kept folding. "Must one be prohibited by law?" Aunt Lydia's mouth went thin. "Sarcasm is a poor dowry. So is dread. That is exactly the kind of fanciful resistance that keeps women poor." Clara set the cuffs down carefully. "I am already poor, Aunt." The older woman looked away first. That small victory did not alter the larger danger. It only made the air in the room tighter. 2 weeks later, while clearing away old newspapers from Uncle Martin's desk, Clara found the advertisement that changed everything. It sat half-hidden beneath a shipping circular and a sermon notice, a square of print from a Philadelphia paper, forwarded north in a bundle of commercial news. Someone, some man, some fool, some honest, desperate soul, had placed a line seeking a woman willing to come west and marry a respectable landholder of sober habits, Protestant faith, and established acreage. Applications, it said, should be sent in care of C. Callaway at the Carlisle post office. There was something awkward and unvarnished about it. No false flourish, no promises of easy life, no pretense that marriage and necessity did not often travel in the same cart. Clara read it twice, then a third time. Her pulse shifted. For 3 days, she told herself she would not answer. On the fourth, Bellamy arrived with a bolt of expensive cloth and spoke in front of Aunt Lydia about how a clever wife need not be beautiful if she was obedient. That night, Clara wrote the letter. She did not write as a dreamer. She wrote as a woman making the first hard bargain on her own behalf. She told the stranger the truth he could be allowed to know, that she was literate, healthy, capable in household management, not given to vanity, and unwilling to attach herself to a drunkard or a brute, that she did not seek romance promised by paper, that she preferred candor to charm, that if the frontier meant hunger, weather, work, and risk, she understood the shape of difficult lives already, if not their exact terrain. Then, after hesitating a very long time, she added one sentence more. If I must build my future beside a man, I would rather build beside one who knows loneliness than one who feeds upon obedience. She sealed the letter before fear could unmake it. What Clara did not know was that the advertisement had not been placed by the man it named. It had been placed by his younger brother. Caleb Callaway had been worrying about Silas for the better part of 3 years. He worried in the practical, infuriating way younger brothers worried when they loved a man too deeply to flatter him. Silas would say he was managing. Caleb would observe the state of the cabin, the weeks without music, the graveyard silence after supper, the way Silas no longer laughed unless forced. Silas would claim there was too much work for company. Caleb, who knew better, would split more wood than necessary just to remain longer on the property and prove that too much silence could be a danger in its own right. Their parents had died 5 winters apart. Their sister had been buried before she was 20. A woman Silas had once thought of courting married a merchant in York when frontier life proved less romantic than town gossip had suggested. After that, something in him turned not bitter exactly, but inward. He poured whatever might once have become tenderness into labor instead. The farm improved, the man diminished. Caleb saw it. So did Reverend Pike, who said little but watched much. The advertisement was Caleb's idea, though Pike had not forbidden it. Your brother may break your jaw, the Reverend observed when Caleb first confessed his plan beside the church shed. He may, Caleb agreed. And if a woman truly comes, then perhaps he will decide whether fury is worth more than company. Pike studied him. That is not a small gamble with a human life. No, Caleb said quietly, but neither is leaving him to freeze alive in spirit. When Clara's letter arrived in Carlisle, Caleb read it under the postmaster's lamp and understood almost at once that this was no fragile lady chasing adventure. The hand was steady, the sentences plain. The condition about drunks and brutes made him grin despite himself. There was iron in the letter, and weariness, and something he recognized from his brother, a refusal to ornament need. He wrote back using his own initials, vaguely enough to conceal the truth, while he sought more details. Over the next month, 3 letters passed between them. Clara asked the right questions. Was the house sound? Was the land secure? Was the man given to temper? Did he owe debts? Did he expect a servant under a holy name? Caleb answered as honestly as he could, without betraying the central deceit. The house was rough, but weather-tight. The land was difficult, but honest. The man was stubborn, grieving, and better than his silences. No, there were no drinking habits to fear. No gambling. No softness either, but decency enough to build upon if she had courage, and he had grace. He nearly confessed twice. Then Bellamy arrived, uninvited, at Lydia Winslow's house and informed Clara that the banns could be arranged in a month. Clara's next letter was shorter than the others. If I come, it will be soon. Caleb read it with a stone in his stomach and knew the matter had run beyond his management. He should have ridden to Silas and told him everything. Instead, he did what frightened men so often do when they mistake motion for wisdom. He arranged the journey first. By the time he gathered enough courage to confess, the wagon carrying Clara Winslow west was already halfway through the rain-churned roads of New Jersey. The journey broke weaker people than Clara. She traveled in stages, with 2 other women for part of the way, then with a family heading inland, then alone with a teamster whose manners were decent, but whose horses limped through mud that swallowed spokes to the hub. She crossed swollen rivers on flatboats that groaned under carts and livestock. She slept in rooms where the bedding smelled of wet straw and old tobacco. She learned how to wedge her carpetbag beneath her feet when men stared too long. She learned that fear, once it had been carried for enough years, could become almost light if it were finally attached to a chosen destination. The farther west she went, the wider the sky became. The towns thinned, trees thickened, roads surrendered to tracks. At one posting inn, she met a woman nursing a child with one arm and loading a pistol with the other. At another, she listened to a widower say frontier grief came in clusters and frontier joy came quietly, so a person had to teach themselves to recognize it before it passed. By the final week, Clara's gloves were worn through, one boot had been re-sewn twice, and her patience had become something harder than hope. Late on an April afternoon, after a day of gray thaw and wheel-rutted roads, she finally saw the Callaway place. It stood on a rise beyond a low creek and a stand of leafless hickories, a log house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, smoke lifting from the chimney in a straight, sober line. No decorative path, no porch railing, no garden yet, only the memory of one in dark earth near the eastern wall. The place looked exactly like what it was, built for use, not display. The teamster hauled her carpetbag down from the wagon and muttered, "If this ain't the right man, miss, you've come a costly distance to prove it." Clara looked at the cabin door. "I suppose we shall learn together," she said. The door opened before she knocked. Silas stepped out into the thaw light, big-shouldered, unshaven, wearing his work coat and an expression of tired vigilance. He looked first at the wagon, then at the carpetbag, then at Clara's face, and whatever he had expected that day, it was not this. For a long second they only stared at one another. Clara saw the weather in him first, not on his coat or his boots, but in the way his eyes had learned distance. This was not a smooth man made rough for effect. This was a man worn down to essentials. There was nothing ornamental in him. Silas saw, in return, a woman exhausted to the bone and standing upright through it by decision alone. Her dress was city-made but travel-battered. Her bonnet had lost one ribbon tie. There was mud on the hem and a bruised dark crescent of tiredness beneath each eye. Yet nothing in her face asked pity. "Ma'am," he said at last. "Mr. Callaway?" "Yes. Can I help you?" Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. "I should rather hope so. I have come in answer to your letter." Silas blinked once. "My what?" The teamster made a noise that might have been amusement and climbed back onto the wagon seat. Clara felt the first true drop of alarm. "The advertisement," she said, "for a wife." Silas went very still. There are silences caused by awkwardness and silences caused by rage. Clara, who had lived among subtler dangers than wilderness, recognized the second kind immediately. "I never placed such an advertisement," he said. At that exact moment, Caleb rode in through the lower field gate with a sack of meal across his saddle and saw the scene waiting for him. Years later, he would describe the sight as every sin in his life arriving at one doorstep simultaneously. "Silas," he began. Silas turned his head slowly. "Caleb." Clara looked from one brother to the other and understood in a rush both the shape of the betrayal and the horrifying absurdity of her position. She had crossed half a world to marry a man who had not known she was coming. Pride told her to turn around at once. Prudence asked where, exactly, she proposed to go with daylight failing and the nearest decent inn half a day behind her. Caleb dismounted with visible caution. "I can explain." "I expect," Silas said with unnerving calm, "that you can." Clara, who had not come this far to become freight in a quarrel between brothers, lifted her chin. "I should like that explanation to include me." Both men looked at her. Caleb had the decency to blush. Inside the cabin, with the teamster paid off and the door barred against the deepening cold, the truth came out in pieces. Caleb confessed. The advertisement, the letters, his fear that Silas was turning into a ghost while still upright, his belief that loneliness was a danger no less real than bad weather, Reverend Pike's partial knowledge, his own certainty, now clearly less certain, that he could judge character by correspondence. Silas listened with his hands braced against the table, his face harder than oak knots. When Caleb finished, silence took the room. Then Silas said, "You had no right." "No," Caleb answered, "I did not." Clara sat very straight in the only ladder-back chair that did not wobble. "That much is plain." Caleb looked at her miserably. "Miss Winslow, I believed that you knew better than either of us," she said. A popular habit among affectionate men. The rebuke landed cleanly. Silas almost smiled despite himself. Clara noticed. So did he, and the almost smile vanished at once. Night had fully fallen by then. Whatever outrage the matter deserved, it had run into the practical wall of darkness, cold, and exhausted horses. No woman could be sent away under such conditions without turning mistake into cruelty. Silas knew it. Clara knew it. Caleb, to his credit, looked as though he would have slept in the barn with relief if ordered. "You may stay tonight," Silas said at last, addressing Clara with grave formality. "In the bed behind the curtain. I'll take the bench. At first light, I can ride you to the Pike place. Mrs. Pike will see you safe until this can be set right." Clara should have felt relief. Instead, she felt an odd flash of disappointment so sharp she nearly resented it. She was too tired to investigate why. The curtain bed was narrow, clean, and warmer than any lodging she had known in weeks. Through the fabric, Clara could hear the brothers murmuring low after they thought she slept. Caleb apologizing again. Silas not forgiving him. The wind moving around the cabin. A log settling in the hearth. Somewhere in the night, beneath exhaustion, she realized that the frontier had already given her one gift the city never had. No one here lied elegantly. At dawn, she woke to the smell of bread. Silas was at the table kneading dough with the expression of a man performing a necessary military action. Clara pushed the curtain aside and stared. "You bake?" He did not look up. "Poorly." That answer did more to steady her than courtesy might have done. By breakfast, an uneasy arrangement had formed. Mrs. Pike, it turned out, had a feverish grandchild in residence and no room for a long guest. The nearest other respectable household belonged to a widower 40 minutes south whose daughters were away visiting kin. Clara could be taken there, but not before the following day. Rain had begun. The creek was rising. Caleb's horse had thrown a shoe. Everything inconvenient that frontier life kept in reserve seemed suddenly eager to contribute. Clara drank her coffee, looked around the cabin, and made the first of the decisions that would shape the rest of her life. "How long," she asked Silas, "before this can be sorted in a way that leaves no one morally ridiculous?" He regarded her from across the cup. "I don't know." "Do you object to my presence specifically, or only to the deception?" Caleb closed his eyes briefly, as if praying someone would kill him and simplify matters. Silas answered with care. "The deception." "Do you drink?" "No." "Strike women?" "No." "Gamble land you cannot afford to lose?" His brows lifted a fraction. "No." "Then," Clara said, "perhaps I might remain until the roads settle and we determine whether your brother's unforgivable interference has by accident produced something not entirely impossible." Caleb stared. Silas stared harder. "You would stay?" "I did not travel 300 miles to faint delicately at the threshold." This time his mouth did change. It was not quite a smile, but it was the beginning of one. So Clara stayed. What followed was not romance in any of the polished forms Eastern ladies had once described to one another over tea. It was work. At first, almost nothing else. The cabin had the order of a place run by a man who valued survival above comfort. The shelves were sound but cluttered. Flour and salt shared space with nails and trapline. 2 cracked bowls remained in service because no one had time to be ashamed of them. A chair by the hearth listed badly to one side. The bed behind the curtain was made each morning with rigid neatness, but there was no curtain tieback, no rag rug beside it, no softness anywhere that did not arise by accident. Clara did not criticize. She reordered. She cleaned out the cupboard, scoured the kettle, moved the kindling closer to the stove, shook months of dust from the window cloths, and declared that if men insisted on keeping flour in damp corners, they should not be surprised when biscuits failed to resemble food. Silas watched this quiet campaign with the bewilderment of a man discovering that domestic skill, when attached to intelligence, could look very much like command. By the 4th day, he found sprigs of dried thyme hung from a beam and asked, almost, "Where did those come from?" "From your own shelf," Clara said, "hidden behind jerky and neglect." "I had herbs?" "You had possibilities." That night, he laughed aloud. It startled both of them. Mutual respect came before tenderness. Clara learned the order of the farm, where the creek froze earliest, which cow kicked if approached from the left, How to judge from Silas's silence whether he was thinking or merely tired. Silas learned that Clara could split kindling accurately, keep accounts in a clean, careful hand, and look a storm in the face without becoming foolish. He also learned that she disliked being spoken for, pitied, or thanked as if she were temporary. On the 9th day, Caleb cut his calf open on an axe edge while helping fell storm-damaged branches near the ridge. Men in pain often become boys again. Caleb swore, bled through his boot, and tried to insist it was nothing until he nearly fell. Silas got him into the cabin. Clara took over the moment they crossed the threshold. "Bench," she ordered. "Boiled water, clean cloth. Not that cloth, the other one. If either of you faints, do it out of my reach." Silas obeyed before he had time to consider that he was obeying. Clara cut away the leather, cleaned the wound, stitched where she had to, and bound the leg with the composure of someone who had spent years tending sickness in cramped rooms where panic only consumed what little strength was left. Caleb, pale with pain, stared at her as if she had transformed mid-scene into a field surgeon. "Your letters did not mention this talent," he muttered. "Your letters did not mention your talent for catastrophe," Clara replied. Afterward, when Caleb slept by the hearth with fever held off for the moment, Silas stood with his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. "You knew how to do that." "I knew it might be necessary someday." "From Boston?" "From being poor where illness was expensive." He looked at her then with something deeper than admiration. Recognition, perhaps. The painful kind, born when one wounded life sees the shape of survival in another. Danger arrived not long after. The frontier had its own polished cruelties, though they wore less perfume than Boston's. Men like Boone Mercer thrived in country that was half law and half distance. Boone called himself a traitor when it helped. Others called him an opportunist, a rustler, a broker in stolen goods, and a man who knew exactly how far a threat could be carried before witnesses became inconvenient. He had long wanted easier access to the lower meadow that touched Callaway land, as well as the creek crossing travelers used in thaw season. Silas had refused him twice the year before when Boone tried to run suspect cattle through the pass. Since then, there had been missing feed sacks at the edge of the property, damaged rails that looked at first like weather, and too many unfamiliar hoof prints near the timberline. Clara noticed the pattern before anyone explained the history to her. "Your troubles have a human shape," she said one dusk, examining yet another broken latch that had been carefully made to look accidental. Silas, kneeling by the hinge, glanced up. "Boone Mercer. Can he be dealt with legally?" He straightened. "Out here, legal and possible are not always kin. Then we should begin collecting what one day may force them to become acquainted." That answer pleased him more than it should have. From then on, Clara kept notes, names at the trading post, dates of missing goods, which riders came through at dusk and which avoided direct questions, which receipts did not match the quantities actually delivered. Her city years, spent copying numbers for men who assumed women never understood the columns they maintained, had given her an eye for small dishonesty. The frontier gave her a wider field in which to use it. At the trading post in Carlisle, some stared when she appeared on Silas's arm for the first time. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way weathered steadiness becomes beautiful once someone learns to see it, but because she was improbable. A Boston woman on the Pennsylvania edge, standing beside Silas Callaway as though she belonged there. Belonging, Clara discovered, was a claim people resented most when it began to look earned. One man asked with false geniality whether the Eastern bride found the mud educational. Clara answered, "Less exhausting than vanity and easier to wash off." Silas nearly choked on his coffee. By June, the cabin had changed shape around her. There was a proper shelf for dried stores. Window cloths were mended. A small patch of kitchen greens pushed up from soil Clara had bullied into order with ash, compost, and will. A rag rug appeared by the bed, then another near the hearth. Silas came in one evening to find a lamp polished brighter than he had ever seen it, and stood in the doorway for a full minute, looking like a man who had reached the right house by mistake. "You've altered the place," he said. "I have made it admit there are human beings living in it." He looked around again, slowly. "It feels—" "Go on." He was not a man given to verbal risk, yet after a moment he said, "Less like waiting out a sentence." That was the closest he had yet come to confession. Clara set down the dish she was drying and met his eyes. Then perhaps it was time. Love, when it came, did not announce itself like thunder. It came in accretion, in the way Silas began splitting extra wood before storms because Clara hated watching the stack sink too low, in the way Clara mended the torn lining of his coat without asking, and then scolded him for carrying nails loose in the pocket again, in the way both of them learned to listen for the other's step. In the evening, he finally told her about the woman he might once have courted, and admitted he had stopped imagining a future after she left, because it hurt less to shrink life to weather, fences, and harvest. In the night, she told him, in turn, about Bellamy and the house in Boston where obedience had been spoken over like a blessing. "Would you have married him?" Silas asked quietly. "If I had stayed," Clara said, "I might have submitted. That is not the same thing." His jaw tightened. No. It was not jealousy. It was something fiercer. A man seeing too clearly what had nearly been done to a woman he had come to regard as essential. When he took her hand that night, he did it with the care of a man picking up a truth he could not yet afford to drop. Their marriage was not immediate. Both were too serious for that. Clara insisted that accident and gratitude were poor foundations for vows. Silas, who respected any truth spoken plainly, agreed. So Reverend Pike began visiting on Sundays when weather allowed. He read with them, talked with them, watched what grew without needing to name it before its roots were sure. Meanwhile, Boone Mercer's pressure thickened. First, a team went missing from the neighboring Evans farm. Then a shipment of salt was claimed delivered to Silas that he had never received, though the charge appeared against his name in the trader's book. Then Caleb, riding in from Pike's with news of suspicious cattle movement near the creek, was followed by 2 men who disappeared before he could force a confrontation. Clara spread the receipts and account slips across the table that night. "They are laundering theft through confusion," she said. "Your name, Evans's name, freight that never arrives, charges that cannot be disputed because no one keeps orderly records once trouble begins." Silas leaned over the figures. "Can it be proved?" "Yes," she touched one page. "If the post deliveries from Harris's store are compared against the warehouse tallies, and if Mercer's men are foolish enough to believe a woman at a counter does not understand columns." "You mean to bait them?" "I mean to let them continue under observation. There is a difference." He studied her face, then nodded once. "Tell me what you need." Partnership, Claire discovered, had a physical warmth to it, not because it softened danger, because it made danger shared. The trap closed in early autumn. Clara went with Caleb to the Carlisle store on the pretext of disputing a flour measure. While the clerk grumbled, she asked to see the shipment book, claiming a domestic need to correct her pantry list before winter. Men who would have guarded information from other men often surrendered it to women under the delusion that detail and power belonged to separate worlds. Clara used that blindness like a key. The entries were enough. Missing salt, duplicate feed charges, one forged receipt carrying Silas's mark copied badly from an old deed. Two wagon numbers that matched animals long known to run Mercer's routes. And best of all, a line of supply credit transferred through a man Reverend Pike knew to be under quiet suspicion already. When Boone rode into the store yard that same afternoon, smiling as if weather and violence were merely different styles of opportunity, Clara already had the evidence copied beneath the folds of her sewing satchel. He looked at her too long. "Mrs. Callaway," he said, though no vows had yet been spoken. Clara smiled with perfect civility. "Sir, you improve every threshold you do not cross." Caleb coughed into his sleeve to hide a grin. Boone's eyes narrowed. "Sharp tongue for a frontier wife. Useful thing to keep when one cannot always rely on frontier law." He stepped closer. "Careful, ma'am." Before Clara could answer, Silas appeared from the far side of the yard, having ridden harder than planned when Pike sent word he thought Mercer might show. He dismounted with the kind of stillness that made other men recall unfinished prayers. "Boone," he said. Mercer shrugged. "Callaway." No scene erupted then. That would have been simpler. Instead, Boone smiled, tipped two fingers to his hat, and rode out as though nothing had happened at all. But he knew by Clara's face that something had changed. So did she. The attempt came 2 nights later, not at the cabin, at the barn. Silas woke first to the horses. Clara woke because he was already moving. By the time they threw on boots and reached the yard, smoke was licking out along the lower wall where oil had been poured beneath dry fodder. Caleb, who had stayed over because of recent threats, came running with a bucket and a curse. The next minute split into heat, mud, shouting, and the frantic, brutal labor of keeping one's life from becoming flame. Clara hauled water until her shoulders shook. Silas cut loose the frightened horses. Caleb beat back sparks with a wet blanket. Somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, hooves pounded away. They saved the barn. Barely. At dawn, black streaks marked the wall. The hay was half ruined, and the truth stood in the yard among them, plain as judgment. "Enough," Silas said. Clara, soot-streaked and exhausted, looked at him over the bucket in her hand. "Yes." Reverend Pike and 3 neighbors were at the place by noon. The county magistrate, who had previously preferred caution flavored with delay, became more interested once he saw the copied ledgers, the forged receipt, the attempted arson, and the presence of men prepared to swear to missing stock and doctored accounts. Boone Mercer had relied for years on isolation, fear, and the assumption that honest people were too busy surviving to organize proof. He had not accounted for Clara. The confrontation that ended him happened not in some dramatic clearing, but at the Carlisle trading post, among barrels, harness leather, and ordinary witnesses who had at last grown tired of being quietly stolen from. Mercer arrived to collect a load of cornmeal under another man's credit, and found instead the magistrate, Reverend Pike, Silas, Caleb, the Evans brothers, and Clara, standing beside the counter with the books open. He laughed at first. Then Clara began reading the entries aloud. Dates, wagon numbers, duplicate charges, false marks, transferred debts, quantities that could not possibly have moved along the roads claimed, not in those conditions and not at those speeds. She read with the cold precision of a woman who had spent too many years being underestimated by men who mistook domestic stillness for ignorance. By the third page, the laughter left Mercer's face. By the fifth, the store had gone silent. By the seventh, two of his own hired hands were looking everywhere but at him. When he tried to interrupt, Silas did not step in front of Clara. He stepped beside her. That mattered more than any threat. "She has the floor," he said. And Clara, because the truth was finally hers to wield, finished the ruin herself. Mercer was arrested before sunset. Not every frontier villain met justice so neatly, but this one had grown greedy enough to make records and arrogant enough to assume no one would ever read them properly. It was, Clara thought, a common male error in every city and wilderness she had yet seen. That night, after the neighbors rode home and the house had settled, Silas stood outside the cabin, looking over the dark fields. Clara joined him with 2 mugs of cider gone nearly cold in the air. "It's done," she said. He took the mug, but not his eyes from the land. "Because of you. Because of figures. Because you knew what to do with them." A long silence moved between them. Not empty, full. Then Silas turned toward her, the last of the dusk holding in his gray eyes. "I have spent half my life learning how to endure what was set before me," he said. "You arrived and taught me that enduring a life is not the same as living one." Clara's breath caught. He continued, slow as if building the courage while speaking it. "When Caleb betrayed us both, I thought only of the insult. Then you stayed. Then you worked. Then you changed this house, and me with it, without ever asking to be mistaken for decoration or gratitude. I do not know how to speak pretty, but I know this. If you choose to leave, I will not stop you. If you choose to remain, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be equal to the mercy of it." There are proposals made with silver, crowds, and polished promises. This one came with barn soot still in the seams of his coat, and truth in every word. Clara set down her mug. "I did not cross all that distance," she said softly, "to build a home and then abandon it to a man who has only just learned he deserves one." His face changed then, finally, fully. When he kissed her, it was with reverence first and hunger second, as though both of them understood the cost of arriving at that moment intact. They were married 3 weeks later under a clear October sky, with Reverend Pike officiating and Caleb standing close enough to be struck if either party decided belated justice still required it. Clara wore a brown wool dress trimmed with cream ribbon that Mrs. Pike insisted upon sewing into better shape. Silas wore his best coat and looked as solemn as if joy were a thing that required all a man's strength to carry correctly. During the vows, Caleb cried openly and denied it afterward. Marriage did not make life easier. It made it shared. There were hard winters, 2 miscarriages that hollowed the house for months, 1 son buried at 6 days old, another child born healthy and loud enough to reset the entire emotional weather of the place. There were seasons of blight, wolves near the lower pasture, and a fever year when Clara slept sitting upright 3 nights in a row with a sick daughter on her chest, and Silas moving between beds with prayers he no longer tried to hide. But there was also laughter now, regularly, stubbornly. There was bread cooling on the sill while children tracked mud over rugs Clara pretended to scold them for. There was the porch Silas built the spring after their wedding, because he once heard her say she missed sitting outside without standing in mud. There were shelves lined with jars, winter stores listed in Clara's clean hand, and a school slate on the table where she taught all 6 surviving children their letters before any of them were old enough to help properly in the fields. The land changed under them. So did the country. Roads improved. Neighbors multiplied. One son moved west again because apparently frontier blood was hereditary and unreasonable. Two daughters married men Clara approved only after making them answer questions they did not enjoy. Caleb eventually found a wife of his own, mercifully by more direct means, and spent the rest of his life telling nieces and nephews that their entire family existed because he had once committed an act of outrageous Christian interference. Silas would grumble when he said it. Clara would not disagree as strongly as she might have. Years later, when their eldest granddaughter asked whether it had been love at first sight, Clara nearly laughed herself breathless. "No," she said, shelling peas on the porch while Silas repaired a harness strap nearby. "It was disbelief at first sight. Respect after that. Love came later and had the decency to earn its place." Silas looked up from the strap. "Speak for yourself. I was impressed the first day she insulted my biscuit." "I did not insult it. You compared it to a roof shingle." "That was not comparison. It was taxonomy." The granddaughter laughed so hard peas rolled off the porch step. By the time Silas and Clara had been married 50 years, the Callaway holding no longer looked like the lonely place where he had once stood, asking the dark sky for mercy. There was a large house now built onto the original cabin, though Clara had preserved one interior wall of old logs, because she said history ought not be sanded smooth, simply because comfort had arrived. There were orchards where scrub had been, grandchildren running paths her first boots had helped wear into the yard, a family Bible full of births, deaths, storms, plantings, and one pressed violet from the first spring she realized she would never willingly leave. On the evening of their 50th anniversary, after the noise of the family supper had quieted and the younger voices had gone indoors, Silas and Clara sat on the porch together, watching the western light settle across the fields. He was old now. So was she. The years had thinned and marked them both. His hands were bent at the knuckles. Her hair had gone white and soft around the temples. Yet when he reached for her, his hand still found hers with the same grave certainty it had on the terrace after Boone Mercer fell. "Do you ever think," he asked, "about what would have happened if you had not answered?" Clara looked out over the land their children had crossed all day in laughter and labor. "Yes," she said. "I think I would have become someone else entirely. Not dead, perhaps not even visibly unhappy, but narrower, smaller. A life survived rather than inhabited. And me?" She turned her head and studied the face she had known in youth, in grief, in harvest light, in fever shadow, in prayer. "You," she said, "would have remained a good man, which is not always the same thing as a whole one." He considered that, then nodded. After a while, he said, "I never told you what I asked for that night." "I know enough." "No, not enough." He tightened his fingers around hers. "I asked God to send me someone. Not beauty, not ease, just someone. And then you came to my door carrying mud on your hem and judgment in your eyes. I have spent 50 years thinking heaven was braver than I deserved." Clara smiled, the deep old smile that had outlived hardship and made a home of everything it touched. "And I," she said, "have spent 50 years thinking your brother was the most dangerous instrument Providence ever used." Silas laughed until he had to wipe his eyes. In the distance, from inside the house, one of the grandchildren began singing a hymn badly and with conviction. Another shushed him. A baby cried. Someone dropped a pan. Life, large and untidy and unmistakably theirs, moved around them. Silas looked toward the sounds and then back at Clara. "All this," he murmured. "Yes," she said. A secret letter, a long road, a prayer fired into winter, a woman brave enough to answer a stranger's need because her own had become unbearable in different ways, a man lonely enough to ask for mercy and decent enough to recognize it when it arrived wearing travel dust instead of miracles. That was how legacies were sometimes built, not by certainty, by courage meeting honesty in a hard place and refusing to turn away. When the evening grew cold, Silas rose slowly and offered Clara his hand. She took it as she always had. Together they went back inside the house that had once been only a cabin, then a refuge, then a marriage, and finally a lineage. The old log wall still stood in the back room, dark with time. Their eldest grandson had carved into one beam the year of the original raising. Beneath it, in Clara's hand, later and smaller, were the words she had once written in her first letter west and copied here after the 40th anniversary, because Silas said the family ought to know the sentence that had started it all. If I must build my future beside a man, I would rather build beside one who knows loneliness than one who feeds upon obedience. Silas touched the beam lightly as he passed. Then he turned toward Clara, toward the lamplight, toward the life their accidental union had made deliberate over half a century, and smiled the smile of a man whose prayer had been answered so completely that even now he still regarded it with a kind of reverent disbelief. And that was the truest thing of all.